And now, please welcome Darren Walker, President of the Ford Foundation, Heather Boushey, Executive Director of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and Gwen Eiffel, co-anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour.
You can clap. Good morning. We are kind of thrilled to be up here today to have this conversation. I'm thrilled because our conversations usually happen in little chunks. They're thrilled because people listen to them for a while and go, okay. But here we have a room of self-selected people of interest who want to talk about stories we're interested in. And as long as they'll let us, we will delve into the details of what you just heard described by Elliot and by the Prudential representative, because what we really want to do is set the stage for a day of interesting conversation, but not just talk about, isn't it a shame, but actually to go beyond it to talk about what the solutions could be. One of the interesting things you may have all noticed is that inequality, or talking about it at least, is in vogue. I remember covering my first presidential campaign where part of the reason Jesse Jackson ran was because nobody was talking about it. And every year there's someone who says they want to run to talk about it, and it doesn't quite get talked about. And we wait for presidential campaigns or for national events or for uprisings and riots and terrible things to have this conversation. Well, here's an in-between moment where we can say that this is important and where we have people on stage who can tell us why it's important, and then where we go from here. Heather Boushey and Darren Walker. Heather has done an incredible amount of work and research on this, and I want her to start by giving us just laying out the groundwork for us on what is the challenge we're talking about and why. There are so many different pieces of it, and I'll walk you through it as we go along.
Yeah, certainly. So thank you, Gwen, and this is just a wonderful event. So happy to be here today. We are living in an era with greater income inequality than the U.S. has ever seen. It's as high or a little bit higher than it was back in the Gilded Era of the 1920s before the Great Depression. And when we think about inequality, a lot of times, especially over the past few decades, we've tended to think about it just in terms of what's happened at the bottom. It's a shame that there's some people that haven't been sort of pulled into our economy. It's a shame that we have too much poverty. But increasingly what we're seeing is that as inequality has grown, it's not just leaving those folks behind at the bottom. We're seeing a squeeze in the middle and this incredible pulling apart of those at the very, very, very top. So while incomes for those people at the middle and the bottom of our society have grown a little bit or not very much or not at all for those at the bottom, you've seen people at the top garnering increasingly higher shares of our society's resources and our incomes. So we need to think about what that means, not just as inequality as this sort of big abstract concept, but what does it mean to have these changes at the bottom, the middle, and the top? And let me just start with the top, because I think we too often neglect the serious economic importance of having a smaller and smaller number of people with more and more earnings, right? What we know is that as people earn more and more and they have these very high incomes, that very soon calcifies into greater wealth inequality. And if there's one thing we know about wealth inequality, it's that if there's a smart kid who grows up in a small town or doesn't have a lot of money, if they don't have access to capital, they can't be the next entrepreneur or innovator, even if they have a really great idea. That wealth inequality really stifles capitalism at its core. And so making that connection in both big ways and small between our rising inequality and what it means for our future economic competitiveness, our future economic growth, is I think the new forefront for what economists are thinking about. I run a center where that's what we're working on, and we're trying to encourage more economists to ask those really big questions. But we have to think about it on all these axes simultaneously.
Why is it that when we think about inequality or discussions about inequality, Heather, we focus so much on the people on the lower end and almost never have any conversation, except in a demonizing way, about the people at the top?
Well, I think often it's, we've heard the politics of envy, that is though
right.
Allowing those people at the top to get more of the money, we're just envious. I mean, so first off, there's a political question there, right? The people who have most of the money control a lot of access to media or resources, and so they can help set the terms of the debate. And our hearts go out to the folks at the bottom, especially in eras when you had a strong middle class. It was like we wanted everybody to kind of be pulled up. Those stories are easier to tell, I think. But the economic effects, which we haven't talked enough about, are I would argue, just as, if not more pernicious, of this rising inequality at the very, very top, because the top is then controlling access to resources, access to capital, access to the resources that give people what economists would call human capital, what many people in this audience might call education and skills. So why do we focus at the bottom? I think it's a little bit of politics, and it's also, I think, where our heartstrings are tugged, and we don't want to sound like we're envious. But in fact, throughout history, societies have found ways to deal with a smaller group of people controlling those resources because we realize it's not good for the whole society or the whole economy.
Darren, the Ford Foundation under your leadership has made a very focused decision to steer its resources, its grant making, toward issues of inequality. And I want you to take us behind the scenes a little bit about how that conversation happened and how you landed on this.
Thanks, Gwen. It's great to be with you and Heather and all of these remarkable people. Our journey began a long time ago on the question of inequality and social mobility. And it is gratifying on a certain level to see it being in vogue, if you will. The foundation has funded courageous grantees for years looking at this challenge, this emerging challenge, going all the way back 2 decades ago. Social mobility, which is connected to inequality. And so for us, as a global foundation, we looked at the significant trends around the world, not just in the United States. And the thing that was most compelling was the fact that everywhere on this planet, inequality is growing. And so while it's great news that 200 million people have been lifted from $1.25 a day in India, the reality is, on many levels, what's happening in India in terms of inequality is profoundly challenging. And for us, inequality is not just about income, because that's what we talk about. Income inequality is one dimension, but what is more pernicious are the consequences. Inequality that is racially based, that is gender based, that is culturally based. And we have inequality in our systems that are baked in. And the challenge is that we have a hard time moving beyond the rhetoric, because I think you're right, people want to talk about it. But when you interrogate the way we need to address it, so we believe one of the great drivers of inequality, and while it's true, the economists give us the technical inputs, we believe cultural narratives that justify why people are poor and excluded is a huge driver.
Give me an example of what you mean by that.
What I mean by that is a cultural narrative in the United States that says that black men are more likely to just simply be criminals. A cultural narrative in India that says Dalits and lower castes deserve to be where they are. They wouldn't be comfortable being on a social mobility escalator. Our culture says that they're supposed to be at the bottom of the caste system. So we have these ways in which systemically, caste informally and formally. And I'll give you an example. I was at a conference recently and there was this conversation about child poverty, and of course the economists were saying we are confounded and it's challenging, and how do we lift these children from these, and of course I sat there and I was one of 2 African Americans in the room, and of course
that never happens.
Never happens. And of course everyone, and so finally I said, okay, am I going to raise? And so I raised my hand and I said, I have an idea. Why don't we stop locking up all their fathers? And I said, if we stop locking up all their fathers, actually we do know empirically that poverty will go down, that student achievement will go up, et cetera. We know this. So why are we locking up all their fathers? Well, we're locking up all their fathers because we have a system that literally has an algorithm in it that is predisposed to racially based outcomes and uneven treatment in a justice system that is inequality. And so the manifestations that wash across our society and our culture are profoundly debilitating and pernicious and contaminates our democracy at the end of the day. This is not just about it's bad for the economy, and it is. It's bad for our democracy because the core of the American idea is the idea of opportunity. And inequality crushes opportunity. It crushes the capacity to dream and to aspire. Because why should you? If the game is rigged, and we know from data that 70% of the American people believe that the system is rigged, that the financial system, that government, that the system. And so if there is not a belief that there is an opportunity through our systems and structures, it's really hard to imagine what our democracy is going to become.
Well, it sounds like you're biting off a really big piece because you're talking about changing hearts and minds, not just changing incomes. And when we talk about inequality, we think about minimum wage. We think about even education. But let's move past the income piece just for a moment, set it aside, and talk about education. Because it seems to me that is as great a driver of inequality and of hearts and minds being in a certain place as anything. But we think in terms of academic achievement when we think of education and number of people with degrees.
Certainly. I'll take that. I also want to just add one thing to what Darren said about culture change, which is that for a long time, you've had sort of a rule of thumb in terms of economic thinking that anything that we do that addresses inequality is ultimately bad for the economy. Ultimately, that means it's a job killer. So we can't do that. Even if we want to, we're sort of thwarted by this hard-nosed economic reality. And now we have a lot more data than we did. That idea was developed long before we were born, back in the 50s, 60s, maybe the 70s. And that idea was developed in an era when we didn't have as much data as we have now. And we're learning that actually that's not true. And so there is.
What's not true?
What's not true is that there are things that we can do that can address inequality. Primarily, a lot of it, which is addressing gaps in skill development and education. But there's a lot of things that we can do that address inequality that are actually good for the economy. So that rule of thumb that there's an inherent trade-off isn't really holding up in the data and in the research. And I think that's an important culture change as well, that you can't let that stop you. We need to really evaluate whether or not that's true. And going back to your question, Gwen, on education, one of the things that we've learned that there is a lot of consensus on, at least among experts, is that the investments that we make in children from 0 to 5 matter more than we could have. Then I think every probably parent knew this, and maybe every grandparent knew it, but the idea that those investments are really what carry through people's lives, and that those kinds of investments that you make in a pre-K program, you can see those differences in those people when they're adults, when they're 40, 45 years old, in terms of the kinds of jobs they have and what their life outcomes are. And so making those investments in education, they're about skill development, they're about making sure that we have access to college, all that's important. But it's also about investing in the parents of young children so they have the resources and the time, and that we address some of these inequalities in job quality so that they have the schedules that allow them to care for their children alongside having access to the kinds of care and pre-K and all of this that really helps people get on that right path early in life. So as an economist, we know that when you look at what is good for our nation, our economic competitiveness, it's about people, right? 4/5 of economic growth is about human capital, it's about people, it's about those investments. That's really what makes us grow. And if we're not making those investments and addressing the huge gaps between children from low-income families and very high-income families, we are not going to be a competitive nation moving forward. So those values and those hard-nosed economics, they go hand in hand.
But I also think that it is true that education is a key input to reducing inequality. But I believe that sometimes it lets us off the hook as a society. I heard of last week a wonderful, impressive interview with the CEO on a business channel, and he was asked about inequality. And he said, what we need to focus on is education. And if we just focus on education, that will solve our inequality problem. And that is just simply not true. Because if we do not address some of the structures that perpetuate and compound privilege, and it is really hard in our culture to talk about privilege, and Gwen, that's partly why the focus isn't on the top often, because it requires the privileged among us, and we are privileged, whether we think we are or not, we are privileged, to interrogate our privilege and to interrogate how we came to it and who doesn't have it. And that is very hard in this country because in many ways we're asking, just as I recently wrote, you're asking those of us who have been created, like the Ford Foundation, by privilege, to actually be tasked with getting privilege under control and interrogating it.
Right.
And that's really, really hard.
That's hard.
And so how do you say to someone who considers himself the successful American dream, billionaire, business person, who has outsized power and influence, to interrogate that privilege? And until we can do that, it's really hard to imagine how simply investing in education, or as another person said recently, we need to just focus on growth. We need to focus on growth. We have had growth in this country over the last 2 decades. We have had tremendous growth, the largest increases in productivity, as you know, in decades, that is not inured to labor. It's inured to capital. And so it's not as if we don't have a track record to demonstrate that focusing only on economic growth will simply not solve this.
Okay, well, let me weave together a couple of things. One is you talked about incarceration and you talked about investing in parents, but so often those parents are women. We're assuming that they are women, that they are single mothers, and that the fathers are absent in part because of incarceration or because of
a lack of jobs, a lack of economic opportunity for that particular population.
Okay, so let's just take that piece of it. How do you begin to close that gap between what you can do for the parents of children and what can you do for parents of children often raising their children by themselves, and what you do to restore those fathers to the picture?
I think it's very hard. I think what we need to do is focus on those fathers, and that is very hard for our body politic.
You like to focus on mothers.
Well, listen, at that same conference, there was a labor economist who presented the OECD report on labor force participation and showed how America was falling and falling. And everyone never mentioned race, I raised my hand again, and I said, if you were to disaggregate that data, I'm sure we wouldn't have fallen to 13th among OE. So, for example, if we took black men out, urban black men out, would we still be 13th?
What's the answer?
No, of course not. We would be between 5 and 7. He was sort of trying to, and I said, but so the challenge is not that America broadly has a labor force participation. We have a problem with particular people in our labor force.
Let me ask you.
Can we focus on those particular people?
Let's ask the economist to weigh in.
Yeah, I think yes and no. So, I mean, on the one hand, we have seen these dramatic declines in labor force participation for both men and women in the United States, and we have seen it across race.
Yes.
So I agree with you that it's a specifics problem. It's also a general problem, and I think too often we've let our inability to deal with the issues around race actually blind us to the fact that we have these bigger problems, because parts of our society don't want to deal with that, so we're not solving any of the problems and actually creating more in the process. But there's some profoundly important fundamental things we need to do if we want to improve our economic outcomes, especially for young people and young workers. I mean, first of all, we need to get back to a full employment economy. Full stop, front and center. That is the most important thing we can do in order to bring up everyone. That's not a targeted policy, but we know that when we have higher rates of employment, that pulls up those at the bottom more than anything else. And so keeping pressure on the Federal Reserve, but more importantly, finding ways to put pressure on Congress to make the kinds of investments that we haven't been making enough of over the past few years is certainly front and center, really important. But above and beyond that, we need to be thinking about what are the labor standards and social policies that we need to actually support today's workers in today's economy. We inherited a system of social insurance and labor standards that was laid out in the 1930s. an era when women had only had the vote for a little over the decade, an era at the height of Jim Crow, where we weren't thinking, where a lot of people were categorically excluded. We've addressed much of that, but we haven't addressed some of the fundamental challenges and the ways that our labor market is changing. You know, we have a lot of workers, maybe workers even in this building, who don't actually work for the employer. They're subcontracted, and so that power relationship is being obscured. All of this, when we're thinking about the challenges in the labor market, fall most heavily on young workers, workers of color, women workers, most vulnerable. So what are the standards that we need? How should we be thinking about our standards? Right now we have an overtime threshold, but nothing else. What about all those people that work unpredictable schedules or that need a little bit of flexibility? What are we doing on thinking about the fact that so many people, moms especially, but dads, have to be caregivers. And so how are we addressing the time that they need away from work?
You made exactly the turn I was hoping you'd make, because I want to end our conversation by talking about solutions, or at least, assuming that we can't solve it all at once, priorities for solutions. Yeah. Starting with you, Darren.
Well, I think we have to address the structural challenges, and it is complex and confounding. I think solutions have to include some of the suggestions Heather has made, but we have to be able to talk about redistribution. Our capacity to actually engage in that conversation is very challenging.
Yeah.
Right. We have to talk about the right kinds of investments that we need to make.
And when you say we,
the American people, and particularly those of us in this society who are privileged and have the opportunity to have influence. And I think we are naive in kidding ourselves if we don't. We in part have gotten here because we have a political system that is increasingly unequal.
But if the political system is also arthritic when it comes to solutions, how do we get past that?
Well, we have to get past it by, in part, making it work. We simply can't have a democracy if our political process doesn't work. And so I don't want to gloss over that or as people sometimes do, well, government can't do, so let's just move on to another solution. There is no solution for these problems without policy, because policy in a market system like ours, which as a proud capitalist, I want to work, but I just want it to work for more people. And it can work for more people. It's not working for more people because we have policies that stilt outcomes for certain people. So it's not as if our economy and we have a free market that it actually is regulated. It's just regulated in a way that generates outcomes that are unequal. And so we have to take that on. And part of that is getting the privileged class, of which I am a part, to have that conversation. What does it really mean in a society when you have a tax policy that privileges some of us over others? What does it mean in a city like New York, which has a huge housing crisis, when I buy a very nice apartment on a park in Manhattan and it comes with a tax abatement? Because a real estate developer has figured out a way to get a law passed in Albany that allows him to build multi-million-dollar condos in the middle of Manhattan, and the purchasers get a tax abatement. How does that happen in a city like New York? It happens because we have a political system that allows that to happen. And that produces inequality. And it also produces cynicism, because the citizenry knows what's up.
They know the game
They
is rigged.
know what that. And so this is what's so insidious and so profoundly insidious about what's happening in our society today.
Well, the good news is that we still do live in a democracy. And I think, everything that you've just said, Darren, really points us towards the fact that we need to be focusing on how to make sure that that democracy is real and that people are informed and that we can push towards the kind of policies that we want to see. I live and work here in Washington, and it clearly is somewhat dysfunctional, shall we say. It has been over the past few years. It's difficult to get the kinds of things that we want to see passed, in no small part because of rising inequality. But part of that answer has to be, and I'm the economist here, so a little bit of a caveat. I am not the democratic expert, voting rights person. That's not me. But I understand that in order for us to get the policies that we need to see, in order to address inequality and have a thriving economy and a thriving society, we do have to deal with the dysfunction, and we have to deal with making sure that government works, and that's up to us as a society, and it's about democracy. But in terms of some of the specific things that we need to do, we have to rethink a set of policies that, to use a word that's already been said, that rig the rules in favor of those at the top getting more and more income and allowing that to, again, calcify into greater wealth inequality.
But I want each of you to give me, in our last minute here, one achievable. I mean, we know what all the problems are, and we know how hard. One achievable goal that we can take away from this, and that you can use to apply to all your thinking for the rest of the day.
Well, I would say we can change tax policy, but let me just say one mindset change we need to have, and I speak from the perspective. I'm not an economist. I work at a foundation, but it's moving our mindset from one of generosity to justice. And what I mean by that is generosity lets us off the hook, because generosity allows us to write a check and feel good. Justice demands that we ask questions about ourselves and our privilege, and whether we are smug and self-righteous about the fact that we are successful, and what we are doing to actually level the playing field. Not talk about it, not write a check to ameliorate some condition. And we need those checks to be written. But that's what's going to be necessary.
Heather?
I would say, the one, we'll give you, I would echo what Darren said on tax policy. I think that it would be very tough to do, but I think thinking about what we need in terms of a progressive tax structure is where I would start to address some of these issues.
Heather Boushey and Darren Walker gave us a lot to think about. Thank you very much.